Sometimes fate arrives in a dusty wagon, carrying promises that no one has asked to keep. The September afternoon was painting the horizon golden when the wagon approached Tomas Miller's property. The 52-year-old watched from the porch of his wooden house, his calloused hands resting on the time-worn railing. He had built that place with his own hands, board by board, dream by dream. Now, after 3 years of loneliness since losing his wife to a fever that swept through the region, he had made a decision that tormented him every night. He had written to a marriage agency in the East. A simple letter, too honest perhaps. He was looking for a companion, someone willing to share a simple life in the midst of the immensity of the territory. It promised no luxury, only honest work and a home where one would be respected. The answer came 2 weeks later. A young woman named Margaret would be sent. 25 years old, orphaned, without family. The agency assured her that she was prepared for life in the West. The sound of the wagon wheels cutting through the dry land echoed like a distant drum. Tomas descended the wooden steps that creaked under his steps. The coachman, a thin man with a grey beard, pulled the reins and made the horses stop. A cloud of dust rose around the wagon, dancing in the golden afternoon air. 2 female figures got out of the vehicle. The first was a young blonde woman in a light blue dress who kept her eyes down and her hands clasped in front of her body. His movements were delicate, almost fragile. The second woman was different. Brown hair tied in a simple bun, dark and practical dress. His eyes roamed the property with genuine curiosity, without fear or hesitation. The coachman cleared his throat and addressed Tomas. He informed that Margaret had arrived as agreed, along with her companion, who had insisted on making the trip to ensure that her friend arrived safely at her destination. The young woman in the dark dress was named Sarah Collins. 30-year-old teacher, she had lost her job when the school in the town where she lived was closed. Tomas observed the 2 women. Margaret seemed to be fighting the urge to get back into the wagon. Sarah, on the other hand, walked slowly through the yard, observing the well-kept stables, the vegetable garden at the back of the house, the chickens that scratched freely. There was something in his eyes that Tomas recognized, the same determination that he had brought to that land years ago. The coachman carried his luggage to the balcony and prepared to leave. Margaret finally looked up at Tomas. There was gratitude there, but also a deep sadness that he could not understand. Sarah reached over and held her friend's hand, whispering words of encouragement that the wind carried away before Thomas could hear. As the wagon pulled away, leaving only a trail of dust in the air, the 3 of them were silent for a long moment. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in orange tones. Tomas invited the 2 women to come in and have a coffee. The house, built to house a family, seemed larger than ever with only him living there. Sarah helped Margaret settle into the room that Thomas had prepared. Meanwhile, he remained in the kitchen, preparing a simple meal. He could hear the 2 talking quietly in the room. There was an urgency in those voices that made him uneasy. When they returned to the kitchen, Margaret looked calmer, but Sarah had a determined gleam in her eye. She offered to help with dinner, moving around the kitchen with surprising naturalness. His gestures were practical, efficient. It wasn't the first time she'd prepared a meal in a rustic kitchen. During dinner, Sarah asked questions about the property, about the challenges of life in that region. His questions were intelligent. They showed a genuine interest in understanding how that life worked. Margaret ate silently, answering only when directly questioned. Tomas was watching the 2 women and began to notice something that deeply disturbed him. Margaret had come because she had no choice. Sarah was there because she chose to be. The difference between necessity and decision was etched on the faces of both, clear as the horizon line that divided heaven from earth. That night, lying in his lonely bed, Tomas heard low voices coming from the guest room, a long conversation, punctuated by heavy silences. There were secrets in that house, brought by the wagon, along with the baggage and the dust of the road. The farmer didn't know it yet, but the decision that would change the course of all of them was being made at that very moment, in the next room, between whispers and suppressed tears. The dawn brought with it a strange stillness. Tomás woke up before sunrise, as he always did, but something in the air seemed different. A dense silence hung over the house, different from the usual silence of dawn in the countryside. It was the kind of silence that precedes important revelations. He got dressed and went down to the kitchen, where he found Sarah already awake, watching through the window the horizon that was beginning to take on the first pink tones of the day. She had prepared coffee, and the familiar aroma brought unexpected comfort to Tomás. Someone had been concerned about these small gestures in their home for a long time. Sarah turned when she heard him coming. His eyes showed signs of a bad night's sleep, but there was a determination in them that Tomás had not noticed the day before. She poured her coffee in 2 enameled metal mugs and sat down at the rustic wooden table he had built himself years ago. The conversation that followed was made up more of silences than words. Sarah talked about the trip, about how Margaret had become more and more nervous as they approached their destination. There was something in her voice, a concern that went beyond ordinary friendship. Tomás realized that she was preparing the ground for something important. Margaret appeared in the kitchen when the sun was already high. Her eyes were red, and she avoided looking directly at Tomás. Sarah immediately got up and walked over to her friend, whispering words of encouragement. The gesture was protective, almost maternal, even though Sarah was only a few years older. During breakfast, Tomás observed the dynamics between the two women. Sarah was clearly the strongest, the one who made decisions. Margaret followed his directions with a docility that seemed more like desperation than gentleness. There was a story there that he didn't know yet, but that he was beginning to intuit. After the meal, Sarah asked to speak with Tomás privately. They stepped out onto the porch, where the morning air still held the coolness of the evening. The mountains in the distance were silhouetted against the clear blue sky, creating a perfect frame for the conversation to come. Sarah took a deep breath before she started talking. He said that Margaret had agreed to come because she was fleeing a desperate situation in the east. A man had taken an interest in her, a man with influence and power who would not accept refusals. Margaret had lost her parents at a very young age and worked as a seamstress to make ends meet. When this man began to pursue her, she had no choice but to accept the proposal of marriage by mail as a way to escape. The revelation hit Tomás like a punch in the stomach. He had imagined that he was offering someone an opportunity, not becoming part of a desperate escape. Sarah went on to explain that she herself had lost her job for refusing to reveal Margaret's whereabouts to the man. That was why he had come along on the trip. Thomas looked through the living room window and saw Margaret sitting in a chair, staring at her own clasped hands. There was a fragility in her that now made sense. It wasn't just bridal nervousness. It was the fear of someone who had spent months living in terror. Sarah apologized for not telling the truth the night before. She said she wanted to see what Tomás was like, if he seemed to be the kind of man who could offer Margaret the security she so desperately needed. He had spent the night observing the house, the care of the property, the kindness with which he had treated 2 strangers. The farmer was silent for a long moment, digesting the information. He looked at his calloused hands, thinking of the letter he had written months ago. He had asked for a companion, not a refugee. But looking at Margaret through the window, he saw something he recognized, the same lost look he had had in the first months after his wife's death. Sarah continued talking, explaining that she had intended to stay only a few days to make sure Margaret was safe, and then move on to San Francisco, where a distant cousin had promised to help her get work as a teacher. But there was something in her voice that suggested that this decision was no longer so clear to her. Thomas asked if Margaret really wanted to marry him, or if she was just fulfilling an obligation out of desperation. Sarah hesitated before answering. She said that her friend was grateful for the opportunity, but that she might need time to recover from everything she had been through before she could build something new with someone. The morning was advancing and the heat was beginning to tighten. Tomás suggested that they would show the property to the two women so that they could better understand what life was like there. Sarah immediately agreed. Margaret, when consulted, only nodded. They walked through the fields, the stables, the vegetable garden. Sarah asked practical questions about planting, animal care, the challenges of the different seasons. Margaret remained silent, but Thomas noticed that she relaxed a little when they approached the chickens. There was something comforting to her in the simplicity of those animals. At the stable, Sarah helped Tomás feed the horses. His movements were natural, as if he had done it many times before. When he commented on this, she smiled for the first time since she had arrived. She said she had grown up on a farm before moving to the city to study and become a teacher. It was noon when they returned to the house. Margaret had found an orphaned kitten at the back of the property and carried it on her lap with touching care. It was the first time that Tomás had seen her show any emotion beyond fear. Sarah watched her friend with a soft smile, as if she were watching a small miracle happen. During lunch, the atmosphere was different. There was still tension, but there was also something new, a possibility that neither of them had considered when the wagon had arrived the previous afternoon. Tomás looked at the two women sitting at his table and wondered if fate had different plans than any of them had imagined. The third morning brought with it a decision that no one had foreseen, but which seemed inevitable like the sunrise over the distant mountains. Tomás woke up to the sound of low voices in the kitchen. It was still very early. The daylight was barely beginning to filter through the windows. When he went downstairs, he found Margaret and Sarah sitting at the table, a serious conversation going on between them. The two fell silent when they saw him, but there was something in the air that he immediately recognized. It was the same feeling that had preceded all the great changes in his life. Margaret stood up and approached him. For the first time since he had arrived, he looked directly into his eyes. There was a new courage there, still fragile, but real. She said she needed to tell him something important, something she had decided during the night. Sarah remained seated, but her fingers drummed nervously on the wooden table. What Margaret revealed changed everything Tomás thought he knew about the situation. She didn't want to marry him, not because he was a bad man or because the property wasn't good enough. She just wasn't ready to be anyone's wife. The last few months in the East had left scars too deep to be healed quickly by a marriage of convenience. Tomás listened in silence, without interrupting. There was a painful honesty in those words that he respected. Margaret continued, explaining that Sarah had offered to take her to San Francisco, where the two could try to rebuild their lives. She was grateful for the opportunity he had offered her, but she knew it wouldn't be fair for either of them to proceed with an arrangement based on desperation rather than genuine choice. Sarah finally spoke up, explaining that she had saved enough money to pay for the trip to California. He said that he had already written to his cousin, who had confirmed that he could help both of them find work. Margaret could work as a seamstress, and she would try to get a position at a school. Tomás remained silent for a long moment, looking out the kitchen window at the fields he had cultivated with such care. A part of him felt relieved. He had realized that Margaret would never be happy there, not the way she was. Another part felt strangely empty, as if something important was slipping through his fingers without him knowing how to hold it. It was then that he asked a question that surprised everyone, including himself. He asked Sarah if she had ever considered staying, not as a marriage arrangement, but simply as someone who could find a place in that land. I had seen how she moved around the property, how she asked intelligent questions about farming, how her eyes sparkled when she talked about teaching local children. Sarah was visibly shaken by the question. He said he had thought about it more than he should admit. Life in the city had become stifling for her long before she lost her job. There was something about that vastness, that honest simplicity, that awakened a part of her that had been dormant for years. Margaret watched them both with a sad but genuine smile. She said she had noticed the way they talked, as if they understood something fundamental about life that she had not yet learned. There was a natural compatibility between them that she recognized and respected. Tomás then made a proposal that demonstrated both wisdom and generosity. He suggested that Sarah stay for as long as she wanted, with no commitments other than helping with the property and perhaps teaching the children of the neighboring families. Margaret could stay too, until she felt strong enough to go her own way. The house was big enough and there was enough work for everyone. The offer was made without romantic expectations, without pressure. It was simply a man offering shelter and opportunity to two women who needed both. Sarah looked at Margaret, seeking guidance from the friend she had protected for so long. Margaret nodded, encouraging her to consider the possibility. Sarah said she needed time to think. The life Tomás was offering was tempting, but she didn't want to make a decision based solely on gratitude or convenience. He wanted to make sure it was what he really wanted, not just an escape from his own problems. Tomás respected the need for time. He suggested that they stay a few more days, at least a week, so that they could get to know the region and the people who lived there better. There was a small school a few miles away that had been left without a teacher at the end of the previous year. If Sarah wanted, he could introduce her to the pastor of the local church, who coordinated the education of the children in the area. During the days that followed, a natural routine was established between the three of them. Margaret tended the garden and the chickens, finding in the simplicity of these tasks a peace she had not experienced for a long time. Sarah helped Tomás with the heavier work on the farm, and in the afternoons taught some neighboring children who came to the property to learn to read and write. Tomás watched the two women adjust to rural life and felt something he hadn't experienced in years. Hope, not the hope of a perfect romantic ending, but something deeper and more real. The hope that sometimes the right people meet at the right times, even when they arrive for the wrong reasons. One afternoon, while watching Sarah teach a group of children under the big tree in the backyard, Tomás realized that life had sent him exactly what he needed, just not in the way he had imagined. It was not a wife that his estate needed, but a partner, someone who shared not only his bed, but his dreams of building something lasting on that land. Margaret approached him as they watched Sarah with the children. She said quietly that she had noticed how he looked at her friend, and how Sarah, despite trying to disguise it, returned those looks. There was something growing between them that transcended marriage agreements or practical needs. It was something real, built on mutual respect and shared goals. That night, the three of them sat on the porch to watch the sunset. The silence between them was no longer tense or uncomfortable. It was the silence of people who had found a temporary peace and were savoring it before making the next important decisions of their lives. The storm arrived on Friday, bringing with it much more than just rain and wind. It arrived loaded with decisions that could no longer be postponed and truths that needed to be said. Tomás had left early to check on the cattle in the distant pastures when the first clouds began to form on the horizon. Sarah and Margaret were in the kitchen preparing preserves with the vegetables from the garden when the first thunder echoed through the property. It was the kind of storm the West knew well, fast, intense, capable of changing the landscape in a matter of hours. Sarah looked out the window and saw the restless horses in the corral. Without hesitation, he ran outside to bring them to the stable. Margaret followed her, holding the kitten she had adopted. The two worked quickly, moving the animals to safety before the storm hit in full force. It was when they were closing the door of the stable that they saw the cart approaching from the road. Even through the rain that was beginning to fall, Sarah immediately recognized the silhouette of the man she was driving. His blood ran cold. It was Harrison Blackwood, the man Margaret had fled from in the east. Margaret saw the expression on her friend's face and followed her gaze. When he recognized the man in the wagon, he began to tremble violently. Sarah took her by the arm and led her quickly back to the house, locking the door behind them. Their minds worked frantically, trying to understand how he had found them. Blackwood got out of the wagon and approached the house with determined steps. He was a tall, well-dressed man with the confidence of someone used to getting what he wanted. He knocked on the door hard, demanding that Margaret leave. His voice cut through the air like a blade, filled with an authority that tolerated no disobedience. Sarah positioned herself in front of Margaret, who had hidden in the room. He shouted through the locked door that they had nothing to talk to him and that he should leave. Blackwood's response was a cold laugh. He said that he had travelled too far to return empty-handed and that he knew exactly where to find Margaret thanks to information he had obtained from the marriage agency. The situation became even more tense when Blackwood began walking around the house, testing windows and looking for other ways to enter. Sarah knew that the rustic locks in the house wouldn't last long if he decided to force his way in. They needed help, but Tomás was too far away to hear any call. It was then that Margaret did something that surprised even herself. She left the room where she was hiding and headed for the front window. In the firmest voice she could get, she told Blackwood that he had no claim to her and that he must leave immediately. His response was a veiled threat about the consequences of challenging a man from his position. Sarah observed the transformation that was happening to her friend. The frail and frightened Margaret of the last few days was giving way to someone stronger, someone who had found courage in despair. It was as if the presence of the man who represented her worst nightmare had paradoxically given her the strength to face it. The storm worsened, and Blackwood was forced to seek shelter on the porch of the house. From there, he continued his psychological pressure, alternating between promises of forgiveness if Margaret returned with him voluntarily, and threats about what would happen if she continued to resist. His words were calculated to arouse fear and guilt. Sarah stood firm by her friend's side, whispering words of encouragement and reminding her that she had choices now. She was no longer alone and helpless in the East. There were people who cared about her, and a place where she could rebuild her life away from the toxic influence of that man. During a pause in the thunder, they heard the sound of horse hooves rapidly approaching. It was Tomás, running back through the storm at the sight of the strange wagon on his property. He dismounted while still in motion and climbed the porch steps, facing Blackwood face to face. The confrontation between the two men was tense from the first moment. Blackwood tried to use his authority and social standing to intimidate Tomás, explaining that he had come to pick up his future wife, who had run away. Tomás listened in silence, assessing the man in front of him with the experienced eye of someone who had dealt with many different types of people over the years. When Blackwood finished his arrogant explanation, Tomás responded with a calmness that was more intimidating than any scream could be. He said that on his property, people were free to make their own choices, and that no one would be forced to do anything against their will. If Margaret didn't want to go with Blackwood, then she wouldn't. The tension on the balcony was palpable. Blackwood was not used to being challenged, especially by a rustic farmer whom he considered socially inferior. He began to make more direct threats, mentioning his political connections and his ability to cause trouble for people who opposed him. It was at this moment that Sarah opened the door and stepped out onto the balcony, followed closely by Margaret. Sarah positioned herself between Tomás and Blackwood, her eyes shining with fierce determination. She said that she had witnessed how this man had stalked and terrorized Margaret, and that she herself had lost her job for refusing to reveal her friend's whereabouts. Margaret, inspired by Sarah's courage and the protection offered by Tomás, finally found her voice. She told Blackwood that she had never agreed to marry him, that her proposals had always been refused, and that she had the right to live her life free from his constant harassment. The rain kept falling torrentially, creating a natural curtain around the small property. It was as if the outside world had disappeared, leaving only those four people to resolve a situation that had begun many miles and many months ago. Blackwood realized that he was losing control of the situation. He made one last attempt at intimidation, suggesting that he could make life difficult for all of them if he didn't get what he wanted. It was then that Tomás stepped forward, his physical presence finally matching the strength of his conviction. The farmer calmly said that Blackwood had two choices. He could leave immediately and voluntarily, or he could be escorted off the property in a less gentle way. There was something in Tomas's voice that made it clear that he was not bluffing. He had defended his land and his family before, and he was prepared to do it again. The storm began to subside, and with it, Blackwood's resistance. He realized that he had seriously underestimated the situation and the people he was dealing with. Unsupported by his urban connections and far from his familiar territory, he was just a man alone, facing three people determined to protect each other. With one last vague threat about future consequences, Blackwood walked down the porch steps and back to his wagon. Before leaving, he looked at Margaret one last time, as if he were memorizing her face for future use. But there was something different in her eyes now. The realization that she had lost the psychological power he had always wielded over her. As the wagon drove away in the dwindling rain, the three of them stood on the porch, watching, until it completely disappeared into the distance. The silence that followed was unlike any they had shared. It was the silence of people who had weathered a storm together and come out stronger on the other side. 3 months later, the property had transformed into something neither of them had imagined when the first wagon arrived that September afternoon. Margaret had left for San Francisco 2 weeks after the confrontation with Blackwood, but she didn't leave as a frightened fugitive. She left as a woman who had found her strength and chosen her own path. Tomas helped her get passage in a safe stagecoach, and Sarah gave her all her savings to start a new life in the big city. Sarah decided to stay, not for lack of options, but because I had found something in that land that I didn't know I was looking for. The small school in the area had reopened with her as a teacher, and children came from miles away to learn. In the afternoon, she helped Tomas with the property, and on weekends they worked together, expanding the house. The romance between them blossomed naturally, like the wildflowers that grow in the desert after rain. There were no grand declarations or dramatic promises. There were long conversations under the starry sky, hands meeting during work, and the silent certainty that they had found in each other's company something rare and precious. In December, when the first snow covered the distant mountains, Tomas proposed to Saraz. Not because he needed a wife to fulfill an agreement, but because he wanted to share his life with the woman who had chosen to share his dreams. Margaret sent a letter from California telling her that she had opened a small sewing shop and that she was happy for the first time in years. He said that sometimes fate uses dusty carts to get people exactly where they need to be, even when they think they are going somewhere else. Spring brought Sarah and Tomas's wedding, a simple ceremony in the town's church, with the children she taught singing in the choir. It was not the wedding either of them had planned, but it was the wedding they chose. That afternoon, as they watched the sunset from the porch of their home, Sarah asked Tomas if he had ever regretted his letter to the marriage agency. He smiled and said that he had asked for a companion and had earned much more than that. I had gained a partner, a chosen family, and the certainty that sometimes the best things in life arrive in carts that bring people completely different from the ones we were expecting. The westerly wind blew gently across the fields, carrying with it the scent of the flowers Sarah had planted around the house. It was the same wind that had brought the cart that September afternoon, but now it was blowing over a land where three people had found their true places in the world. If you enjoyed this heartwarming Wild West story, please leave your like and subscribe to the channel for more narratives like this. Share in the comments. Have you ever been in a situation where fate has completely changed your plans? Activate the bell so you don't miss any of our adventures in the heart of the Wild West.